right, hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of Freightonomics. I'm Zach Strickland. He's Anthony Smith, lead economist here at FreightWaves. Welcome to Freightonomics, where we discuss the freight market and combine it with some macroeconomic flavor to give you the information you need to go about your day in transportation, logistics, or whatever sort of business that you are in involving freight and economics. So, Anthony Smith.
We're back again.
We're back.
And we're at the desk.
We're at the desk.
We're at the desk.
This is actually my request. I like the desk. I feel comfortable at this desk.
We're getting rid of it soon.
Yep,
anyway,
obviously.
We can't kick this show off without first thanking some of our sponsor. And our sponsor this show, I think throughout the month, is Amazon Freight. And we're so thankful for our sponsor, Amazon Freight, who sorry. Can't have throat issues again 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah, here we go again. Get him some water.
I got this. Amazon Freight, who knows you need more than another truckload service provider. You need a partner who can help you navigate the world of logistics and plan for the future. Amazon Freight is helping shippers move their freight simply and reliably, while backed by the innovation and expertise that's in the DNA of Amazon. Whether you have a few truckloads to fill or thousands to move, Amazon Freight is your opportunity to put Amazon to work for you. Visit freight.amazon.com to get started.
Yeah, and Amazon is obviously like busy. busy. They're going to be obviously a huge part of the freight economy moving forward. And Anthony, I'm glad, we do have a bottle of water for you if you need this week.
Yeah, that was rough last week. But we have the best team in the business, and they covered well for me. I appreciate them.
Yeah. So, Amazon in the news a little bit here in a minute, but first let's get to our meme of the day.
What do we have?
We have a meme of the day this week, and I think, I've let off the last couple of weeks just because I like memes. I think everybody likes memes. The Willy Wonka meme is probably one of my favorites. So you want to use memes to teach economics? Tell me more about how clever you are. I will, Willy Wonka. I will.
I don't know. So we have show notes. We prep for these things typically, Yeah. For some reason, I completely missed this meme.
How do you miss this meme?
I missed this meme.
Do you like the meme?
I enjoy it. Yeah,
of course you do.
Economists usually think they're smarter than they are.
Well, I would teach everything in memes if I could.
Yeah, I feel like they're a valuable or a meaningful way to convey information in a short, succinct way.
And we are effectively teaching people some form of economics every week. But let's get to our stories of the day.
Yes.
Now that we have gone through our meme of the day. So, this is kind of, our show today is built around some of these ongoing stories. We wanted to break it down a little bit in more detail because normally we spend about 5 to 10 minutes talking about some of the topical stories of the day. We felt like these are probably some of the more relevant stories that are going to continue to be news that need some extra explanation and coverage and exposure. So we're going to break this show down into some of the main stories that have been having a little bit of stickiness in the headlines, ongoing, to help some of our audience, have a little deeper understanding and therefore a little bit more information to see what this actually means in relevance to the rest of the freight market. And the first one up, this has been, I don't want to say that it's been super sticky. The Amazon union vote over a warehouse facility in Bessemer, Alabama. And they voted against forming a union. Now, regardless of the players here, and obviously Amazon is a huge warehouse and logistics provider throughout the United States. And, I kind of wanted to look at this from the angle of what is the benefit and why is this such a big deal inside the scope of the business of freight and logistics? Unions, of course, have had a very long history in the United States. We have declined significantly in terms of the percentage of the workforce that is unionized, over the last 40 years or so. The statistics that were reported in Bloomberg in a specific article covering this, unions represent just 6.3% of the private sector workers, down from 24.2 in 1973. So there has been a huge decline in unionization and that's force, and since that period of time, and obviously since the early 1900s. And I think it's useful to kind of break down what's the purpose of a union, What role have they played? What role do they play? Have they kind of grown out? Have we kind of grown out of the need for unions? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it kind of shows, there's a few things that are kind of declining in popularity. Unions, and another one, pensions. I mean, when we're looking at today's marketplace, there's a few things that aren't as common as what we saw, a few decades ago, or maybe even a decade ago. And we're looking at things like even, for example, a pension. A lot of it's now going to be into 401ks, and how do you roll that over? And so there's a lot more movement in today's, I think, workforce.
Yeah,
where
we have more options than ever before. I think unions were largely grown out of like this environment of the Industrial Revolution, where we had a lot of, I mean, my great-grandmother worked in a mill in South Carolina, her fingers to the bone. They didn't have a lot of options. You didn't have the mobility that you have today to move places. I mean, think about this. My great-grandmother was born in, the early 1900s. They were just starting to get cars. Cars weren't like readily available. So to go to, from Nashville to Chattanooga, that was a huge investment of time, effort, energy. You had to spend weeks doing this. Now you can do it in a matter of hours. And we can move up and we can transition our families and stuff so much easier now. Industry has grown out of this environment where you don't have a lot of options. Back then, you kind of grew up in an area and you were kind of sticky. You were stuck in that area. You had to specialize a lot more. I think that's where unions do have a purpose nowadays, is in that specialized space where you are having to commit basically your life to a certain skill set. I think the sports, the sporting industry, to sound older than I am, is actually a good use case for the unionization, because it is very much a commitment of your time and energy. Okay, boomer. and that you have to have some sort of security, some sort of stabilization in. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're looking at unions, it creates a standardization, and there's the other part of me in my economic mind where I'm thinking, you know what? No, one size doesn't fit all. Everyone needs to have their best interests being played out. And so sometimes I'm just thinking, when I'm looking at these unions, is this for the best interest of the individual, or is it just for the group? What's best for the actual person themselves? And so it's not always a one size fits all. And as we're seeing today, a lot of people jumping around. You're staying at a job for 2-3 years. You're going on not to just a new job, but maybe in sometimes an entirely new industry altogether. You learn a new skill set. That wasn't a thing, like you said, back in the day. Years ago, you kind of stayed in that lane that you carved out, and you stayed there for 20 plus years, and that's where you knew you were going to retire at. That's not the case, and as a result, we'll see that unions aren't that prevalent anymore today.
Yeah, and having been, a part of an industry myself that has dealt with some level of, people trying to get into, debating the unionization in transportation. There's still several unions operating in the, in the transportation and logistics industry and space. The retail and wholesale industry is the one that was trying to get unionized here, or trying to increase their, their membership base here. Now, if it's, to a financial analyst like myself back in the day, unions would have been extremely troublesome. They would have created an extra layer of administration, bureaucracy, legal fees, all sorts of other stuff. And that doesn't necessarily work out for the employee in a lot of cases. You have all this other energy and time that has to be spent maintaining another layer of administration. So in some of these larger companies, that layer of administration slows things down even further, because you have to go through extra levels of negotiation. It's no longer a FreightWaves negotiating with Zach Strickland or Anthony Smith. They now have to go through an intermediary to to get to you. And that you lose a little bit of, you may gain a little bit of number or weight in terms of negotiating power, but you are also subject to what the group is also trying to get after. So you lose a little bit of your self-interest in all of that as well.
Yeah, and that's a big part. One thing that you mentioned that interests me was the bureaucracy of it all. And the movements of just, processes. I hate processes. I hate orders of operations that I just want to get to it. What do we got to do? What's going to be the end result? So that's going to be one thing that kind of slows things down. And those needs might be outdated by the time they're actually implemented, when we see how quickly some of these unions might move. But Zach, We're almost halfway through.
Way through.
And we are just now getting through our first story. What's next?
Let's do the next one. So Ever Given, basically the Suez Canal container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, the Ever Given, essentially this came out that they're going through a process now where a lot of these containers are actually still stuck. The Egyptian government has seized the Ever Given and are basically holding it hostage to the price tag of roughly $1 billion in costs. And there's this fascinated me, Anthony. I don't know if you had time to look through this in detail, and I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. Because I didn't know this existed, but there's an old shipping law that basically says anytime a container ship or ship is, had to be freed by government or had some sort of disaster, the people that were responsible for the containers and the cargo are asked to foot part of the bill. This is like, I can't even imagine what that would be like, in trucking or surface transportation, where the transportation provider went out and said, you know what, we messed up. Could you pay us for this?
Yeah.
But this is apparently a very accepted rule in container shipping, and I would love to hear Henry Byers' take on this. We need to get him back on as a follow-up.
I would love to hear Henry Byers. And it's just like this story keeps on going. It's like the ever given is ever giving. It doesn't stop.
I like that. That's clever. Just like the memes.
Shout out to Cody Mathis on that one.
Yeah, so I mean, and they're having to go around, and this law of averages is basically, it doesn't matter how much your cargo was worth. The cost is is spread out evenly across everyone. So if you had some scrap metal, recyclables, garbage that you had it on a container, you're paying the exact same amount per container as the person that had the electronics.
That's wild.
Yeah, this whole thing to me is so outdated and antiquated now, but I guess people that are in this space regularly, and this is where I would love Henry Byers or Greg Miller or somebody else, obviously our American Shipper team probably has a good perspective on it, to kind of add some more clarity on how this is actually a thing. And because this freight too, and Lazy Boy was one of the few, companies that actually represented themselves as having some of this freight being held hostage, and it won't be let loose until they settle this, and they're saying that it could take 2 to 3 years.
That's insane.
To get all of this sorted out so that all of that cargo can get delivered. And
would that cargo sit for 2 to 3 years?
I don't know. They're basically asking the Egyptian government to release it ahead of time while they get the insurance company, because you're talk about bureaucracy.
Yeah.
You've got multiple international governments, insurance companies, multiple corporations. I mean,
that's like a headache.
I mean, this sounds like a complete cluster of disaster in terms of whatever. The last quote of the article basically says, and this is on the Wall Street Journal, I should reference, Ever Given customers face new payments to get shipments moving. The ship will be released because if the Egyptians want people to keep using the Suez Canal, they can't hold it for ransom. The general average process will take years to sort out in the biggest Excel sheet you've ever seen. I mean, I don't want to manage that Excel sheet.
I'm also thinking like whoever is working on this, because it's a little bit somewhat unprecedented on this scale. You kind of get the benefit of just saying, hey, yeah, this is going to take, I don't know, X amount of hours per day. Like you might even start milking it at that point. So that's when I start getting skeptical. I'm like, you know what? Where's all this money going to? And so I can only imagine just the complete waste that is going to come from all of this.
Yeah, this process needs some updating, I think. I think this one will probably inspire that. Some of these companies. The ship's owner, Japan's Shoei Kaisha Limited, pardon my pronunciation, is the one that is expected to settle these claims. And then, of course, Evergreen Marine Corp of Taiwan is the operator here. So the ship's owner. So this is how it goes. Like Evergreen is the company that is, the operator, but the people that own the ship are different entities. So that's how far back this law goes. I think it's somewhere in the 1800s, 1890, I believe, is when it was referenced as to begin having started. Back when we were talking about frigates and things of that nature, and we didn't even know what a container ship was at that point. But it's this is something that I think while these continuing disaster kind of unfolds, it still continues to be so fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it kind of keeps it a theme of like old timiness, like we have these old outdated laws, we got unions, it's just like.
Well, we've got blue laws, you talk about blue laws, and that's what essentially, this feels like a blue law that has a huge ramification. You're talking about things that were made, put in bill or local governments in like the 1700s that are still around because it just takes too much effort to repeal them. And nobody really even enforces them or brings them up, but this is one that they still do that with. So let's move on to the next one. So, I think the supply chain bottlenecks are not a big story in terms of like, this is news, but it is a continuing, ongoing story, and it's going to be one for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
I mean, and the semiconductor problem is one that we've heard about significantly over and over and over again over the last several weeks. The automakers, Mike Baudendistel last week on Freightonomics referenced it, as being, this is going to impact freight, because if automakers have to pause the assembly process, they're not asking for more inputs. And then of course they're not shipping those out as well. So it means, this is going to, impact all sorts of other tangential entities in the automotive manufacturing space, but not just them. We're talking about transportation and trucking as well. OEMs, they also require those chips.
Yeah.
So the ongoing capacity crunch in the trucking space, this is part of the problem too, because most of the vehicles now do have some sort of smart capability. They have onboarding systems.
Computers.
They're all computers. Everything's computerized now. Even Anthony Smith is a computer.
I'm a computer.
And Mike Baudendistel, just wrote this piece on FreightWaves.com. He does this weekly newsletter called the Stock Out, and the article is cleverly named "What Ketchup Packets and Semiconductors Have in Common," and he outlines some of the things, obviously ketchup packets are now going to be in shortage, along with the semiconductors, and there's all sorts of products and commodities like this, and you just wonder, and I wonder, Anthony Smith, how many of these products, we all think about what we consume at the end of the result, the automotive, the cars, the ketchup, but what about the products that are going into the ketchup and the auto parts? I mean, these are also things that are at risk, and suppliers that are at risk, transportation providers that are also, their networks are getting disrupted by these intermittent disruptions to the supply chain.
Yeah, and this is one of the areas that I was really kind of honing in on a couple months ago when we kept seeing that the ISM PMI prices index, or component of it, kept remaining elevated, and was so elevated because we saw that so many commodities were in short supply, and it's just been across the board, whether it was semiconductors, corrugated boxes, of course, thanks Amazon, and we're looking across the board, whether it be wood products, polymers, anything and everything, electrical components, all of that is in short supply, and that's creating this increase in pricing, but it's also going to create shortages. So it's just wild to kind of see how it's going to manifest itself as it moves further and further downstream.
Yeah, and there was an article on FreightWaves.com, I believe John Gallagher wrote it, talking about, basically the trucking industry is saying, you know what, all of this stuff isn't going to matter because, you're ordering more trucks. We're not going to be able to put them on the road. So I want to pull up a sonar chart of our Class 8 orders by ACT Research, just to show what Class 8 equipment orders have done. This is, of course, the tractors that are hauling your big 53-foot, reefer and van trailers across the United States. Orders spiking at the end of last year. Now, what this means is these are just orders. This is the demand for the equipment. So some of it, we're coming off an extremely soft 2019. Everybody overbought, equipment in 2018. They went out, they bought a truck because the market was super hot. They decided to go invest in fleet, adding some to the fleet size as companies do. And then they were doing the same thing towards the end of the year last year. But these have a 6 to 9 month cycle. And I was talking about this a little bit on Midday Market Update yesterday. They're not going to hit, they don't at best chance in a normal environment when supply chains are moving smoothly, which this is not. That means that those trucks that were ordered back in November, December, they're not getting here until June, July, August on a good year. And we're not in a good year.
Right.
So that means that this capacity crunch could persist. This is just the equipment side, not the employment side, which we'll get to in just a second.
So speaking about this, I think this is one of the questions I had for you last year was because, of course, we're kind of in the beginning of the pandemic. And we spoke about how the trucking industry is usually a bit slower to react. And usually the pendulum swings and it's like a little bit too late. Then we get this burst of, new trucks on the road, but we don't quite have that demand anymore. And then they all kind of, go off, but now we need more. And so is this going to be one of those situations where it's just like, this is a little too late. We needed it like last year.
Yeah, no, I mean, in general, the larger you are, the slower you are. I mean, that's just a law of physics.
Yeah.
I mean, the larger providers tend to react a little bit more slowly because they have to go through layers of bureaucracy, as we've talked about a little bit today. But also, like, you have you have a higher risk exposure. If you do get into a market that is oversupplied, as the one in 2019 was, that means that you're going to have to get on a lot of quarterly calls that are very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because you're struggling just to keep your trucks on the road. And since the market is so fragmented in trucking, you're talking about, 92%, 93% of the trucking companies out there have less than 20 trucks on the road. So that means that you have a lot of competitive units competing against each other. So if everybody buys a truck all at once, the water level rises quickly.
Yeah.
And once these trucks hit the road, obviously there's need for it. But what about if demand slides out? That's what happened in 2019. We overstimulated the economy a little bit. We had tax cuts, we had hurricanes, we had ELD, mania, things like that had everybody thinking, okay, the market is going to just persist at this level forever. And it totally didn't. Demand was still high, but the supply side rose much faster. And this is the way it happens. If you remember that chart, that's a spike in orders. That wasn't like this even distribution. You do not want to spike in anything. I don't care if it's positive or not. That's obviously one of the arguments for our economic growth right now. Spikes are unsustainable. They're very unhealthy in terms of management, because that means it's very volatile. You have little wavelengths. Think about a rock hitting the water. You've got something it's very heavy and dense hitting the water all at once. You have ripples that go over time, and that's something that we'll probably continue to see in the trucking industry for years to come as we go through these ebbs and flows of supply and demand.
Yeah, and I think that's very well said. It's like those spikes are going to be shocks to the system, and they're going to have impacts. And so one of those impacts, not just so we're talking about the equipment side, but there's also been an employment impact as well.
Yeah, and this is right up your alley. This is why I wanted to finish on this topic. And you've talked about this, I don't know how long now. You have been criticizing those employment numbers by the BLS so long, and I think they've even criticized their own numbers.
They did.
At this point.
Got to give them some props.
There's so much noise in them. So using employment figures right now appears to be like really not a good measure of the economy overall. And we're looking at trucking employment right here. So basically, truck transportation, this is your back office workers as well as your drivers. And you can see here that we are nowhere near the employment level that we were before the pandemic. And that to me tells me that, people haven't gone out and replaced their workers. But one of those headwinds is the fact that a lot of the workers aren't trying to get back into the workspace.
Yeah, and that was one of the areas that was really kind of honing in on during the pandemic, because it kind of made sense with, the discouraging of individuals to kind of go back to the workplace, because you wanted to have that incentive, like, hey, stay out of the workplace. You know what? We'll pay you additional cash on a weekly basis, whether it was originally $600 per week or something like that.
Yeah.
Or on top of the existing benefits, and then the stimulus packages. And that was like an incentive to stay home. And we still see some people incentivized to stay home, or now it just comes from not even being incentivized as much as there's this fear. And so that's a deep issue when you're looking at trying to restart the economy. And as you mentioned, I don't look at the particular numbers at a very close level when we're looking at these employment numbers. I'm starting to look at just the direction. Right. Is the direction moving up or down? And looking at the different reports, whether it's the Census Bureau, the Census Bureau, but the Census Survey that we have up here, BLS, the initial jobless claims, looking at multiple reports from multiple different outlets. Right. It's
always good to have a few.
Yes, to show where they are pulling their numbers from, and if these numbers are actually telling the similar story. And when we're starting to see that 3 or 4 of them are showing that there is an increase in employment, that's a good sign. But not getting too caught up in the actual numbers, because we see revisions on a regular basis. We see the initial jobs claims come up and down, and then the previous week's numbers get revised up 30,000 some Americans that have been applied for those unemployment benefits. And so there's a lot to kind of poke at, but thankfully we're seeing that there's some positivity overall happening, and that's going to have some implications where we see, hey, do we keep on, with these stimulus packages?
Right.
Is it going to be a state-by-state thing? Because, a state opening up sooner is going to be able to kind of be a little bit more productive, and, employment's going to be a lot more varied in that state and those industries compared to, a state that's, maybe still shut down. So New York and California compared to Texas and Tennessee. And so we're going to see a lot more varying economies and employment markets or job markets as we look throughout the country.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about industries. There's certain states that are industry heavy.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a very uneven recovery process for a lot of these industries, especially ones that rely more on service. Now, Florida is booming right now because everybody went down there. The New Yorkers are down there right now. They've moved down. We've seen some of the flows of population.
We're in Florida right now. Look at the background.
Our Crystal Lugo is from Florida, so she's one of the few that has left the state to come up to Tennessee. But, as this is, I think that really at the bottom of this is, are these employers going to have consistent issues hiring people? We've heard about it consistently. We're not out of the woods with the pandemic just yet. We haven't eased all these restrictions, even though a lot of companies have gotten back to a decent flow of work at this point. Drivers being hired right now, they can't hire them fast enough. It takes a long time to get a driver trained up when you're talking about a new driver. The experienced drivers have other options right now. They could go into work for themselves. So some of these larger carriers don't have the access that they used to the, because a lot of drivers get their start in these larger places. I got my start in a larger company. That kind of tends to be the flow of how people kind of move from a large company. They get a lot of experience, training. It's a great place to go. Drivers are not much different in that regard, where they move from the larger companies into the smaller companies, and then maybe one day they show up as, their own owner-operator in control of their own destiny. So. Right. That's going to have a long-running impact. I don't think, the stimulus package itself is going to keep some people out of the, application process. But do you think we're going to see this surge of people just showing up one day and be like, oh, wait, I actually need a job now. My stimulus package ran out.
Yeah, so that's the thing. It's like, if the inflation numbers are going to really starting to pick up now, because it was a little bit lower because early on, because there was that employment issue. Like people were staying at home, they weren't producing. And I know we have our last minute here, but when we're looking at what the US is doing, the US has opened up a lot more sooner with these vaccine efforts compared to the rest of the world. Now we are even consuming more. But with that, that's going to increase import prices because the rest of the world hasn't caught up just yet. And so that's going to increase some of these inflationary numbers and inflationary pressures. And it's not just moving from the assets, because I know in the few weeks, I'm saying the inflation is in the assets right now, looking at stocks, looking at cryptocurrency, looking at housing. And now we're starting to see it actually hit the consumer at these, at the gas pump and other areas like that. So
yeah, I think
a lot going on.
You're doing a good thing, because I think next week we're going to break down what happens we're going to break down this spending bill. We're going to let's see what's going on inside of that and what future implications it has for everybody, including the transportation market. So thank everybody for watching so much. Download the FreightWaves TV app on podcast players everywhere. Look up Freightonomics or look up Freightcasts and get every FreightWaves podcast available. Again, thank you so much for watching this week. Anthony Smith, drink more water.
Drink more water. Shout out to the TV team. Emila, Aaron, Ethan, Frazier, Harrison, Jimmy.
Giving them all.